They thought tearing down my dam would finally put me in my place. After months of warnings, letters, and threats, the HOA showed up with bulldozers, all because I refused to pay a few so-called maintenance fees. I stood there, watching as years of hard work and protection for our land crumbled into mud and water. They laughed that day, proud of their victory. But they had no idea what they just unleashed, because within days, the skies opened, and nature decided to take my side. What happened next? No one in that neighborhood will ever forget. Before everything fell apart, the neighborhood looked like something out of a magazine. Clean lawns, quiet mornings, and the same polite smiles that never quite reached the eyes. The kind of place where every mailbox matched, every flower bed was trimmed, and every rule was printed in a binder thick enough to choke common sense. To outsiders, it seemed perfect, but to anyone who lived there long enough, it was clear. Perfection came with a price. I had moved there for peace. After years of city noise and chaos, the small, lakefront community felt like a dream. My property sat at the very edge of the neighborhood, where a natural stream curved into a small pond, the kind of quiet beauty you don't find often anymore. Over the years, I built a small dam there, nothing huge, just enough to protect my land from erosion and to keep the water steady during heavy rain. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. It made the area look beautiful too. Ducks came every spring, kids would stop by to feed them. Everyone seemed happy. Well, almost everyone. At first, I didn't think much of the HOA. They sent newsletters, hosted meetings, and reminded people to keep their trash cans hidden. Normal stuff. But soon, I began noticing their tone. They weren't just managing, they were controlling. They had opinions on fence colors, mailbox designs, and even the length of grass. And when someone didn't comply, the letters started coming. When my dam caught their attention, I should have seen the storm coming. It started small. A note on my door one morning, politely asking for clarification about a non-approved structure on my property. I called the number listed, expecting a quick chat and an easy fix. Instead, I got a clipped voice explaining that any structure altering community drainage patterns required HOA approval, even if it sat on private land. I explained it had been there for years, that it wasn't causing any problems. But that didn't matter. Rules are rules, they said. From that point on, everything changed. The next few weeks, I began noticing the same HOA members walking near my property more often, clipboards in hand, whispering, pointing at the dam. One afternoon, I came home to find a bright orange notice pinned to my gate. Violation, unauthorized construction. I remember just staring at it, confused and angry. It wasn't just about the dam anymore. It was about power. Neighbors started avoiding eye contact. Some whispered that the HOA was cracking down on rule breakers. Others told me quietly to just give in, to pay the fine and move on. But it wasn't about the money for me. It was about principle. That dam wasn't hurting anyone. In fact, it protected the whole lower area from flooding every rainy season. I had built it with my own hands after watching the stream overflow one summer and ruin half my yard. The HOA didn't care about any of that. I appealed their notice, sent them photos, even offered to pay for an independent inspection. But each time, the answer was the same: remove the dam or face penalties. And every time I refused, the letters got harsher. First came the fines, then the threats of legal action, and finally, the one that made my blood run cold. Failure to comply may result in HOA-led removal of the structure. I remember holding that letter under my porch light, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. It didn't feel real, like something out of a bad story you'd hear from someone else's neighborhood. Surely they wouldn't go that far, right? But deep down I knew they would, because this wasn't just about rules. It was about control. The HOA board, a handful of people who thought they owned the whole community, couldn't stand being challenged, and I had become the symbol of that challenge. Still, I refused to back down. I took pictures, documented everything, and even started keeping a small notebook. Times, dates, copies of every letter they sent. Part of me believed logic would win, that reason would cut through the nonsense. But as I'd soon learn, reason had no place in a war where pride was the enemy. And while I was busy defending what was mine, the real storm, the one that would expose everything, was quietly building over the horizon. It started with letters, small, polite reminders, written in the kind of tone that pretends to be friendly but carries a quiet threat underneath. Please be advised, as per HOA regulation, failure to comply may result in further action. At first, I tried to ignore them. Then came the fines. $50 for unauthorized alteration, $100 for non-compliance. When I didn't pay those, the fees doubled, then tripled. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about control, and they were tightening their grip. The HOA president, a man named Richard, loved to remind everyone of his responsibility to uphold community standards. He'd walk around like a self-appointed sheriff, measuring lawns, peeking behind fences, snapping photos of things that didn't fit the aesthetic. Most people stayed quiet, afraid of ending up on his bad side. I wasn't one of them. One afternoon, I found him standing near the edge of my property, camera phone in hand, taking pictures of my dam from every angle. He didn't even look at me when I walked up, just kept snapping away like I was invisible. When I asked what he was doing, he said flatly, "Documenting a violation." That word, violation, stuck with me. It made me sound like a criminal in my own yard. Within a week, the HOA called a special board meeting about unapproved structures impacting community water flow. I wasn't even invited, but one of my neighbors, who still had a bit of decency left, slipped me a copy of the meeting notice. They planned to discuss removal procedures. I showed up anyway. When I walked into the community center, the room went quiet. Richard sat at the front with his little nameplate and that smug expression that made my blood boil. Around him, the board members, people who once smiled at me during block parties, now avoided my eyes. The air was thick with quiet judgment. They spoke in technical terms, hiding behind policy and procedure, but their intent was clear. They wanted my dam gone. I argued, calmly at first, that it was on private property, that it caused no harm, that I'd even maintained the stream bank for years at my own expense. But they didn't want logic. They wanted obedience. When the meeting ended, they voted, 5-0, to order removal. I remember walking home that night, the sound of crickets mixing with the dull buzz of anger in my ears. My dam, something I built with my own hands to protect my land, was now considered a community threat. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, a bright red notice was nailed to my mailbox. Final warning: HOA will proceed with demolition if structure is not voluntarily removed within 14 days. 14 days. I spent the next 2 weeks calling, emailing, pleading, trying to find some way to stop what was coming. I even spoke to a lawyer who sighed and said, "It's tricky. Technically, HOAs can enforce actions that affect shared property lines or drainage systems." "Even if it's on my land?" I asked. He hesitated. Even then. So I did what anyone would do. I documented everything. Every letter, every photo, every conversation. I kept them all in a folder, just in case. But documentation can't stop bulldozers.
On the morning of the 15th day, I woke to the sound of engines. I looked out my window, and there they were, a small crew, 2 trucks, and Richard standing proudly beside them, clipboard in hand. My stomach dropped. I ran outside, shouting, demanding to see paperwork, permits, anything. He just smiled and said, "The board has authorized this. You've had your chance." Then, the machines roared to life. The sound of concrete cracking and metal tearing echoed through the air. My dam, the small wall I'd built stone by stone over years, came apart in seconds. Mud, water, debris, all of it rushed downstream. It felt like watching years of effort wash away in front of my eyes. Neighbors peeked from their windows but said nothing. Some filmed, some whispered. Richard stood there, satisfied, as if justice had been served. By the time it was over, the dam was gone. Just a pile of broken rocks and swirling brown water. My land was flooded, the stream's banks torn open, and the water level rising fast. I wanted to scream, but there was no point. The damage was done. Over the next few days, things got worse. Without the dam to hold it, the stream changed course slightly, just a few inches at first, but enough to start eroding the slope near my property. When I reported it, the HOA said it wasn't their problem anymore. You should have complied, they said. But nature doesn't care about rules or board meetings. Within a week, a heavy storm rolled in, the kind that turns every ditch into a river. The ground was already unstable, and now, without the dam, the runoff from higher ground poured straight through the neighborhood. Water pooled in driveways, basements flooded. The drainage system designed to handle steady flow couldn't manage the surge. The same people who had cheered for my dam's demolition were now watching the water creep up their lawns. Panic spread quickly. Sandbags appeared. Pumps ran all night, but it was useless. The small pond that once sat peacefully behind my house had transformed into a roaring current, cutting through yards and driveways alike. Richard called an emergency HOA meeting. Of course he did. The same man who bragged about community order now stood helpless as nature tore through his carefully controlled world. He blamed me at first, said my dam must have weakened the terrain. But the truth was simple. The dam had protected everyone. Without it, there was nothing left to slow the flood. I stayed quiet. I watched. Every storm that week brought new damage, more erosion, more flooding. The HOA scrambled to hire engineers, file insurance claims, and repair drainage lines. But it was too late. The cost was in the hundreds of thousands. One night, Richard showed up at my door, soaked and shaking. His backyard had collapsed halfway into the stream, the same stream he swore my dam had interfered with. He didn't even have to say anything. I could see it in his eyes, the regret, the fear. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Nature was doing the talking now. But the story didn't end there. The damage spread farther than anyone expected. The water had shifted direction, undermining several properties. The HOA, desperate to find someone to blame, tried to claim I was responsible for modifying the terrain without approval. I handed them my folder. Every letter, every photo, every timestamp of their demolition order. They went silent. The insurance company denied their claim, citing negligent action by authorized HOA representatives. Suddenly, the same board members who once voted unanimously against me began turning on each other. Meetings grew heated, accusations flew, resignations followed. The perfect neighborhood was falling apart, not because of a storm, but because of pride. I watched as Richard, once the self-proclaimed protector of community order, resigned under pressure. His reputation was gone. The HOA's funds were drained by repair costs and lawsuits. Several homes near the stream had to be rebuilt entirely. The people who once looked down on me now came to me quietly, apologizing. Still, the land didn't forget. The erosion left scars that no amount of landscaping could hide. Even now, when it rains, the water follows the same destructive path it carved that day. A permanent reminder of what happens when arrogance meets nature. And as I stood on the edge of what used to be my dam, watching the sun set over the water, I realized something. The HOA thought they could teach me a lesson about following rules. But in the end, nature taught them one about humility. And it was a lesson they'd never forget.
The storm had passed, but the damage stayed, not just on the land, but in the hearts of everyone who'd once believed the HOA was untouchable. Driveways cracked, lawns washed away, and homes once showcased in glossy community brochures now sat dark and ruined. But the board didn't admit fault. Not yet. Instead, they doubled down, desperate, defensive, and cornered. Letters started going out again, this time to every homeowner in the neighborhood. They claimed the flooding had been caused by a former resident's unapproved construction activities. My name wasn't written, but everyone knew who they meant. The same people who once whispered that I should have just followed the rules were now whispering something different. They're trying to blame him after what they did? Still, the board clung to its story. They held another meeting, this one open to residents, to discuss ongoing community repair efforts. I showed up, not because I had to, but because I wanted them to see me. When I walked in, the room fell silent again, just like the first time. But this time, the atmosphere was different. No smug smiles, no sideways glances of superiority, just tension, fear, guilt. Richard sat at the front, paler now, his confident posture replaced by the nervous shifting of a man who'd finally lost control. Papers lay scattered before him, reports, invoices, and insurance claims, all stamped with red denial marks. The meeting began with formalities, the same stiff politeness as always. Then came the financial update. The HOA was bankrupt. Insurance had refused to cover the damage. Legal fees were mounting. The community's repair fund, built from years of collected dues, was gone. Richard tried to sound composed. We are currently exploring legal options to recover losses related to unauthorized modifications of community drainage. That was it. I'd had enough. I stood. The entire room turned toward me. My voice shook at first, not from fear, but from months of anger finally finding air. Unauthorized modifications? I said. You mean the dam you ordered destroyed, the one that protected this neighborhood for years? A few residents murmured. Some nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing for the first time what had really happened. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. I placed a thick manila folder on the table in front of him. Every notice, every email, every photo, every letter signed by this board approving the demolition. You said it was necessary. You said it was dangerous. And now look. I pointed toward the back window. Through the glass, you could see the waterlogged lawns, the broken fences, the sandbags still stacked where people had fought to keep the flood out. That wasn't me, I said quietly. That was you. Silence filled the room, the kind that stretches, heavy and endless. Richard's jaw clenched. The vice chair, a woman who'd once been his biggest supporter, looked down at her notes, pretending to read. Then from the back of the room someone spoke. He's right. It was my neighbor, the same one who'd slipped me the meeting notice months earlier. That dam never caused a problem until they tore it down. Now my basement's ruined. My insurance won't cover it because they say it's the HOA's fault, and the HOA says it's his. So who's actually going to take responsibility? More voices joined in. One by one, homeowners stood, each telling their story. Water damage, destroyed gardens, cracked patios, all traced back to that one decision. Richard tried to talk over them, banging his gavel like a desperate drumbeat against the tide of anger. Order! We need to maintain order! But there was no order left to maintain. Someone shouted, "You should resign!" and the room erupted. Shouts, arguments, tears, years of quiet frustration finally breaking open. And in that chaos, Richard did something that sealed his fate.
He slammed the gavel down one last time and shouted, "I was following procedure." The room went still again. I stepped closer. Procedure doesn't destroy private property without consent. Procedure doesn't ignore warnings. Procedure doesn't lie to its own residents. I reached into the folder and pulled out the last document, the one I'd been saving. It was a copy of the insurance investigator's report. I read aloud. Flooding determined to be direct result of unauthorized HOA-led demolition. Claim denied. HOA accountable for subsequent property damage. The words hit harder than I expected. Even I felt the weight of them. Richard froze. The color drained from his face. The vice chair whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. He just stared, not at me, but at the document, as if seeing for the first time the full cost of his pride. Within a week, the story spread beyond the neighborhood. Local news stations picked it up. Homeowners Association causes flooding after illegal demolition. Reporters showed up, cameras rolling, capturing what was left of the neighborhood's once perfect image. The HOA that prided itself on order had become a local joke, a cautionary tale of arrogance gone too far. The fallout came fast. Residents called for a special election to remove the board. Richard resigned before it could happen. 2 other members followed. Lawsuits started flying. Homeowners against the HOA against the contractors, contractors against the board. The web of blame grew until it collapsed under its own weight. For me, it wasn't victory. It was vindication. I rebuilt what I could, reinforcing the stream's edge and adding new barriers where the dam once stood. But I didn't rebuild it out of spite. I did it to protect what remained. Still, every time I looked at the muddy water, I couldn't help but remember the sound of those bulldozers and the look on Richard's face when his empire of rules finally crumbled. One afternoon, as crews worked to repair the drainage lines the HOA had once destroyed, Richard came by one last time. No clipboard, no gavel. Just a man, tired and hollow. He stood there for a while, looking at the stream. "I didn't think it would turn out like this," he said softly. I didn't respond. There wasn't anything left to say. He sighed, turned and walked away, back toward the neighborhood that no longer saw him as a leader, but as the man who broke it. The next storm that came wasn't as bad as before, but the water still rose high. The new drainage plan, designed with proper permits this time, held, mostly. But nature, like memory, doesn't forgive easily. Every time rain hit the rooftops, every time thunder rolled through the valley, you could see the nervous glances from homeowners who remembered the flood. They still talk about it sometimes, not the way they used to, with pride, but with caution. The HOA still exists, smaller now, quieter. The new board learned a hard lesson from the old one. They talk less about rules and more about responsibility. And me? I stayed. People often ask why. After everything, after the damage, the stress, the loss, why stay in a place that tried to bury you? Because sometimes, standing your ground isn't about winning. It's about showing that no one, not even an HOA with all its power, gets to erase what's right. When the next meeting came around, the new board asked me to speak, to share what happened and how it all began. I stood before them not as an enemy, but as a reminder. I told them that rules mean nothing without reason, that power without humility leads only to ruin, and that when people forget the value of fairness, nature has its own way of reminding them. I ended my story the same way I'll end this one, with a truth that cost me everything to learn. They thought breaking my dam would teach me a lesson, but in the end, nature taught them one.
When the floodwaters finally receded, the neighborhood looked like a battlefield that had been reclaimed by the earth itself. Grass that once formed perfect stripes now lay matted and brown. Fences leaned at odd angles, the walking paths were cracked, the lake cloudy with mud. Even the proud sign at the subdivision's entrance, Clearwater Estates, a community of excellence, tilted, half buried in the silt. But something else had washed away with the water. Fear. For years, the HOA's rules had kept people silent. Residents followed every order, trimmed every hedge, painted every shutter, because breaking a rule meant fines, humiliation, or worse. Now those same neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, helping each other drag ruined furniture to the curb. The old hierarchy had dissolved with the soil beneath it. In the weeks that followed, insurance adjusters came and went. Reporters, too. The story spread across local news, then onto the internet, shared under headlines like HOA's demolition decision floods entire community. Each broadcast showed the same images: the collapsed stream bank, the broken dam stones, the hollowed-out yards. No one could spin that kind of evidence. One by one, homeowners began filing claims and complaints. The HOA's lawyer resigned after realizing he'd been kept in the dark about the demolition order. A new interim board was appointed, neighbors who'd never dreamed of holding power but now understood the cost of letting the wrong people have it. I stayed quiet during most of it. I'd already said everything I needed to say. My job was to rebuild, not just the land, but my peace. I spent hours clearing debris, placing stones back along the stream, shaping the ground so water would flow safely again. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance. Nature doesn't seek vengeance. It seeks correction. And that's what this entire mess had been, a brutal correction for years of arrogance. For months, I watched as the HOA unraveled. Without funds, they had to beg volunteers to clean common areas. Their manicured flower beds turned wild. The pristine neighborhood newsletter stopped arriving in mailboxes. The illusion of control had vanished. Some residents moved away, unable to face the constant reminder of what had happened. Others stayed, slowly realizing that a community without compassion isn't really a community at all. The new board changed policies, rewriting pages of regulations into a single, simple promise: we will manage with respect. I never thought I'd hear those words spoken in a place once ruled by threats and fines. Months later, I was invited to speak at the annual meeting. It wasn't about blame, it was about rebuilding. The room looked smaller now, less formal, less intimidating. Folding chairs replaced the heavy conference table that used to divide residents from the board. Coffee mugs clinked softly as people waited for me to begin. I didn't bring notes this time. I built that dam because I believed in protecting what we share. Water doesn't care about property lines. It moves the way it needs to move. If you fight it with pride instead of planning, it will remind you who's in charge. Heads nodded around the room. No one argued. No one interrupted. I told them that rules have a place, but empathy must come first. That communities fall apart when power replaces reason, and that we can only live peacefully when we remember that nature and decency don't answer to bylaws. When the meeting ended, several neighbors came up quietly to shake my hand. Some of them had voted for the old board. One woman admitted she used to report people for small violations because she thought it was the right thing. Tears filled her eyes when she said, "I didn't know what it felt like to be on the other side until now." Forgiveness is a slow thing, but it starts in moments like that. As spring arrived, I rebuilt the pond where the dam once stood. I didn't use concrete this time, just stones, gravel, and native plants to hold the soil. I wanted something that could breathe, move, and adapt. The ducks came back first, then the frogs, then the dragonflies that sparkled in the sunlight like pieces of glass. One morning, a group of kids from the neighborhood stopped by. They skipped rocks across the water and asked what happened here. I told them the truth, simply, that once upon a time, people forgot to listen, to each other and to the land. And when you stop listening, you stop learning. They nodded, even if they didn't fully understand. Maybe one day they will. By summer, the neighborhood had changed. It wasn't perfect, never would be, but it was real. Yards looked different now, shaped by individual taste instead of a single rule book.
People talked more, laughed louder. The same stream that had caused so much division now brought them together during weekend cleanups. Sometimes I'd sit on my porch and hear the sound of rakes, shovels, and conversation. It was the sound of rebuilding, not just of soil, but of trust. Richard moved away quietly. No one knew exactly where, and no one really asked. Every so often, I'd hear bits of gossip, something about him trying to join another HOA board in a different town. Whether he learned his lesson or not, I'll never know. But I like to think he did. Everyone learns eventually, even if the lesson comes the hard way.
The legal aftermath dragged on for nearly a year. Courts ruled that the HOA's leadership had overstepped its authority and violated private property rights. Damages were awarded to several homeowners, including me, for property loss and emotional distress. It wasn't about the money. It was about acknowledgement. The court's words mattered. An HOA's duty to enforce rules does not outweigh its obligation to act with reasonable care. Reasonable care. Two simple words that could have prevented everything. When the final ruling came down, I stood again by the stream. The water moved quietly, almost lazily, under the afternoon sun. The land had healed more than I expected. Grass grew where mud once swallowed fences. The air smelled clean, like rain on new soil. And in that stillness, I realized something important. This story wasn't just about one dam, one HOA, or one neighborhood. It was about how easily people forget that power, without humility, will always collapse under its own weight. Communities don't fall because of storms. They fall because of pride. If the storm taught me anything, it's that nature always restores balance one way or another. You can fight it, deny it, or ignore it, but it will have the last word. As the camera of memory pulls back, if this were the closing shot of a video, you'd see the stream winding peacefully through the land, framed by homes that finally understood their place beside it, not above it. You'd hear the soft rush of water over stone, the echo of a world set right again. And maybe, just maybe, the viewer would take a quiet breath and ask themselves, how many times have we built our own little dams out of pride? How many times have we torn down something good because we needed to feel in control? That's the real question. Because this story, like most, isn't really about an HOA. It's about all of us. About what happens when power replaces compassion and when nature, in its patient way, reminds us that balance isn't optional. As the sun sets over the repaired pond, the final light glints off the water, and for a moment, everything is calm again. The chaos, the anger, the loss, they've all been washed away, leaving behind a lesson etched deeper than any rule book could hold. They thought breaking my dam would teach me a lesson, but in the end, it taught everyone one.